Thank you for joining us today. This is Cody Parsons here with a special guest, Derek Broyles. We are continuing our summer series discussing the book of Mark.
All right, let's read Mark chapter 2. We're going to read verses 23 through 28. Once again, I'm reading from the New Living Translation. Here's what it says. One Sabbath day, as Jesus was walking through some grain fields, his disciples began breaking off heads of grain to eat. Verse 24, but the Pharisees said to Jesus, "Look, why are they breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath?" Jesus said to them, "Haven't you ever read in the Scriptures what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God and broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests are allowed to eat. He also gave some to his companions." Then Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people, and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath." You know, this is an interesting passage, I think. And one reason being, when I think of the Pharisees here, especially in this story, I think it's interesting to me that they ask the question, why are they? You know, and I think what happens is in our own Christian life, if we're not careful, we can spend more time thinking about, focusing on, and looking at what other people are doing versus examining ourselves and what we are doing. It's a lot easier for us to see flaws in other people than it is for us to see flaws in ourselves. And I'm not saying that the Pharisees, saw a flaw in the disciples. My point being, we need to spend time examining ourselves way more than we need to worry about what other people are doing. Now, there comes a point where, yes, we don't compromise on sin, but my point is, we need to make sure that we're not asking those questions or why are they. We need to ask more often, why are we? And then we can help the they if it's something that we can help them with. And my second thing I want us to talk about is Sabbath for a second. Now, I'm going to be real transparent, real honest with you. When we think about Sabbath, we can correlate that with the word rest. And when we think about that, rest is a gift from God. You see, God designed rest to refuel us and redirect our spiritual lives. But truth is, if you know me, if you've ever spent more than 5 minutes with me, I can't sit still for very long. And what happens is that same thing translates when I go home at night. It's hard for me to switch my brain off, and it's hard for me to just turn off with what I'm doing. But the truth is, the Sabbath or resting is a spiritual discipline. We have to discipline ourselves, not in a manner of being lazy all day, but we need to reconnect and redirect our lives and our focus. And to me, that's the point of the Sabbath. It's a reset. It's a reset from the craziness of life, the busyness of life, and just the reset that we need. And that's my thoughts on these verses.
Yeah, it's interesting as I read these verses because one of the things that I take away is that I think Jesus was getting at these Pharisees had turned the Sabbath into an idol. And what I mean by that is when we read Jesus' words, he says the Sabbath was made for man, not the man for Sabbath. In other words, the Sabbath is a gift from God for man to rest. It is not something that man is required in a sense to do. In other words, God did not make the Sabbath and say, okay, here is the list of things you're going to do. And so what I think is really happening here is Jesus is pointing out to these Pharisees, you have turned this Sabbath into an idol. It is something that you are now worshiping and making more than it really should be. Again, I think that goes back to when Jesus brought up about David and Abiathar, the high priest. The house of bread that was consecrated, they had turned that bread into their idol. In other words, they had put that bread above God himself and pleasing God. And I think sometimes we do that with the Sabbath. We make that Sabbath into something more than God. In other words, the Sabbath to us is greater than Jesus. We think if we do the Sabbath, we're good. But the truth is, it is only Christ. The Sabbath is made for our rest. It is not made to make us into this person God wants. It's made for rest for us. And I think that really goes into what we see in Mark chapter 3. And I'm going to read verses 1 through 6 of Mark 3 out of the NIV. You will follow along. Because it says, "And another time he went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. And some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, 'Stand up in front of everyone.' Then Jesus asked them, 'Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, or to save a life or to kill?' But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, and he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians on how they might kill Jesus. And I think this ties into that thought on, again, turning things into idols. Because here's the thing: the Sabbath to them, you could not do anything, good or evil, on it. They had such a strict restriction on what was considered work on the Sabbath that you were basically sitting there thinking the whole time, did I do work? Did I do this? Did I do that? Did I displease God? When the reality is, again, the Sabbath is not to be taken as an idol. The reality is the Sabbath was made for us for rest. And I think we are so guilty, especially in the South and in our Bible Belt, of taking church services and making them into an idol. And what I mean by that is we don't like changes. We want our standard order. We want our standard hymns. We want our standard this, standard that. And if we deviate from that, somehow we feel like we've displeased God. When the reality is church service is not this structured set of order things we do that somehow please God. No, the church service is made for us. It is made for us to come in to and worship the God who we were created to worship. Church service is not about singing 3 hymns and a sermon and then going home. No, church service is about worshiping God and God alone. It is for us to feel that rest and that recharge when we do worship.
And I think for me, I'm going to switch gears here real quick. But in verse 2, when it talks about Jesus, I find it intriguing. And the New Living Translation says it this way. It says, "Since it was the Sabbath, Jesus' enemies watched him closely." So we're going to come back to that. But then it says that if he healed the man's hand, they planned to accuse him of working on the Sabbath. You know, one thing that blows my mind as I read throughout the Gospels is so many times people wanted to discredit Jesus. And what I think is applicable in our own life is I think people do that to not just Jesus, but also to Jesus' followers. You see, what happens is people are skeptical of Jesus, maybe because of the lack of whatever it may be for Jesus' followers. You know, what happens, and I preach this all the time, and it's so important to understand, is we cannot put our faith in people. I don't care how good of a person someone is. You cannot put your faith in people, because at the end of the day, there was only one person on this planet that was perfect, and his name was Jesus. And so my point is we have to put our faith in God, because he will never fail us. People will always fail us, but Jesus never will. But my point that I want to draw back to is, notice it says they were watching Jesus. The truth is, people are watching us. And the hard thing is, we don't know who that is. We don't know when that is. We don't know where that is. But people are always watching us, which doesn't put a impossible standard for us to follow. It just gives us a humble reality that, hey, people, if you claim to be a follower of Jesus, people are going to watch you. And what kind of example are we living? Are we living a life that others would want to follow, is what I think. But the other part of that too is, if Jesus himself had critics, right? If Jesus himself had people that criticized him and, talked bad about him, tried to accuse him, what in the world makes us think that people won't do the same for us? You see, now the difference between Jesus and us, again, is while Jesus, there was nothing that people could point that he did wrong in our own lives, and I can only speak for me, in my own life, there are so many things that people can point to that I've done wrong. So in other words, if Jesus had accusers, if Jesus had critics, what makes us think that we will not? Thank you for joining us today. We hope that you are enjoying this series through Mark, and we look forward to releasing more, and hopefully you'll tune in and listen in next week. Just real quick, if you would subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to, it will help you get notifications for when we release new episodes. We hope you have a great rest of the week, and look forward to you tuning in next week.